My name is Martin Kamer, and we're sitting here in my Swiss home, in my library, and I'm going to talk about my working relationship with Rudolf Nureyev. I used to study set and costume design in London at the Central School of Art and Design, and I graduated in 1965. And then I worked as an assistant in the costume department of the Royal Shakespeare Company in Stratford-upon-Avon. And I was really looking for another job in the more design-based. And then through the grapevine, I heard that the Australian international designer, Barry Kay, was looking for a research assistant. He was designing the third act of the Raimonda ballet, Raimonda's Wedding, for the Royal Opera House, Covent Garden, and Rudolf wanted him to develop a new kind of tutu. So I got sent to the museum to research 19th century tutus, which I then did, and did a couple of drawings, and with Margot Fontaine's tutu maker Marjorie Rogers, we developed a new tutu. Rudolf hated a flat plate tutu because he said it cuts people in half, and I don't want to see arse hanging out. So we developed this sloping A-line tutu, which is still used everywhere. And when I designed the Kingdom of the Shades act from La Bayadère at the Opera House in Paris in 1972, we of course had these tutus made for Paris. And all the French dancers hated it. And they came to me and said, we hate this tutu, can't you do anything about it? Because tell Rudolf we don't want it. I said, well, you don't know Rudolf, but Rudolf gets. So this tutu is now used everywhere, and it's called the English tutu, but except it's actually the Rudolf the Nureyev tutu. So because that was a success, Barry Kay then used me for other productions, and especially for the building of the model for this Raimonda ballet. And it was very exciting because Rudolf was the biggest star at the time in the classical world. He was like a Mick Jagger equivalent in the classical world. And he used to come by to look at Barry's costume designs and how the work was in progress. He was very hands-on with the designers. He was really interested. He wanted his vision to be on stage exactly how he felt it was right. And he had very definite ideas. And so it was quite exciting. Rudolf came by quite often, so we were like little schoolgirls giggling in the corner. Rudolf also worked with a designer whose name was Nicholas Georgiadis. And Nicholas Georgiadis was designing the Sleeping Beauty ballet for Rudolf Nureyev's choreography at the Scala in Milan. And Nicholas also was a friend of Barry's, and they came by, and then I said to Mr. Georgiadis, I speak Italian, can I be your assistant in Milan? And he said, oh no, darling, this is the Scala Milan, I don't need an assistant. And I said, I knew he needed one, but so I said, well, I will be in Switzerland at my parents' home. Can I come down to Milan and sit in at the rehearsals? And he said, yes, that's fine, come on. So I went to Milan on a Sunday, and I walked around the town, looked at all the shops, and it was the first time in Milan. And then on Monday morning, I presented myself at the Scala. And Nicholas went, it's a disaster, can you stay? And full well knew, so I started working with him as an assistant. And I didn't get paid for it, of course, but I was invited for lunch and dinner every day. And it was very interesting because there was talk about films and opera and literature and music. So I learned an awful lot, and that was very interesting. And Nureyev was quite impressed that I spoke 5 languages. So he said to me, you my secretary. And I said, no, Rudolf, you're crazy. I don't want to be your secretary, because I saw how he had a secretary and how badly he treated her. And I thought, no, not me. Anyway, he had a reputation as a big sort of tartar, a big volatile thing. But if you worked well with him, but if he trusted you, then you worked extremely well with him. It wasn't easy, but he hated people, shirkers. He hated people who didn't pull their weight. And if he felt you pulled your weight, and then he started trusting you, you could also tell him, no, that won't work, and he would accept that. So my work at the Scala was very interesting, and then I went back to London, and I worked again at the Royal Shakespeare Company. And then Nicholas had designed the Nutcracker Ballet for Rudolf in London, and this whole production went to Milan. And the designer couldn't go to supervise it, and his assistant couldn't go either. So I was second choice to go to Milan and supervise the production. And I only heard afterwards that Rudolf wanted to have in my contract written in that I had to be in bed by 9 o'clock at night, because he felt I was a party boy and wasn't going to do the work. And of course, when Rudolf came, guess who we went out with every night? It was him, of course. So that was a very interesting 5 or 6 months. Rudolf had a great sense of humor, and he sometimes liked to clown about. And as we were doing this Nutcracker in Milan, there's a bar outside the Milan Opera House, the Bifi Scala. And before the afternoon rehearsal, we met and had a drink outside. And he was joking around, and these 2 Midwestern American fat tourists were walking by, and they stopped and looked back and discussed something. And then they came back and said, could we have your autograph? And so Rudolf signed it. And when they left, they said, our children just love the Monkees. The Monkees was a pop group. And they thought he was well known, so they thought he was part of the Monkees. Yeah, Rudolf, to my great surprise and to everybody else's surprise, he was very pleased with the work I'd done. That wasn't a surprise, but to everybody's surprise, I got a first night present from him, which he never did. I got a big fat envelope with about $500 in it, which was a lot of money in 1966. And so obviously he liked working with me. And then that production transferred, or was made again in Buenos Aires in 1972. And I went to Buenos Aires for 3 months to put this production on stage. And I got there, and I brought Nico's designs, costume designs, and his model. And because the model had been made for the Opera House in London, it was a model 1:25. But the stage at the Teatro Colón in Buenos Aires is much bigger. So we scaled it up a little bit and said it's got to be measured as 1:24. And when I got there, the director of the stage design department didn't want me there, because he wanted to design the production. It would have been a feather in his cap to design a production for Nureyev, but Nureyev wanted his design, and there was a big toing and froing till I actually was allowed to go and supervise. So I got there, and on Monday morning met this guy, Mr. Oswald, who talked to me in English, and I told him that the model was 1:24, and he said, yeah, go ahead, bet. And he then said I had to be at every meeting, and I said, well, that's what I came out here for. I'm here to supervise and hands-on. And so next day he presented me to the design staff, the people who actually built the sets. So I did a run-through with the set and the scene changes and everything. And he spoke in Spanish to them. And he said that this is a model, it's 1:25 in Spanish. He didn't know I could speak a little bit of Spanish. So I piped up and said, no, señor, él lo dijo que es 1:24. And he just lost face. And it was quite wonderful. He was quite hated in the opera house, and I became the darling because I had sort of showed him up. So that was fun. And it was really weird work because they had the procurement of the fabrics was done by lottery, and it was extremely difficult, and they didn't have any tool to make tutus, and then I didn't choose anything, and I got hauled before the director of the opera house, and who said, I hear that you're not choosing the fabrics and blah, blah, blah. And I said, well, I would like to choose the fabric, but this is not a provincial theater. This is the Teatro Colón in Buenos Aires and blah, blah, blah. And he said, yeah, but I said, yes, I've got the right color, but it's tweed, and I can't make tutus with tweed. So in the end, we were able to get through the Coca-Cola company, representative in Buenos Aires. He was the boyfriend of the ballerina. Were able to import these tutu net from England. So finally we were able to make tutus. And when Rudolf came out, it was chaos. Nothing was ready. And I said to him, it's not ready. And he said, oh, don't worry. This is far away enough. If it's good, everybody will hear. If it's bad, nobody will hear. He was really quite pragmatic. After Buenos Aires, I went on a trip through South America. I have family in Brazil, so I went to visit the family in Brazil. And after Rudolf had finished dancing his 10 performances in Buenos Aires, he came to Rio to do a one-night performance of 3 ballets. And he arrived, and they were doing Apollo Musajet by Stravinsky, and the Grand Pas de Deux from Sleeping Beauty, and another ballet. I can't remember what the other ballet was. And when they got there, they realized they didn't have an orchestration for the Pas de Deux in the Tchaikovsky Pas de Deux for Sleeping Beauty. Nobody found a orchestration in whole of Brazil, so they had to sort of muddle along. So the rehearsal was concentrated basically on that and not on the other stuff so much. It's an old tradition when artists go on a sort of guest appearance somewhere, they get paid in cash before the curtain up. Because in the 19th century sometimes happened that the impresario just vanished with the money and the artists never got their paid. So I was in the dressing room with Rudolf, and we were chatting away, and he's making up and he's getting ready for the performance. And there's a knock on the door, and he said, Mr. Nureyev, 3 minutes for the first ballet. And he said, where's my money? Oh, it's coming, it's coming, it's coming. Okay, so he went on and did the first ballet. And then back in the dressing room, getting ready for the second ballet, the Apollo Musajet, and knock, knock, Mr. Nureyev, 3 minutes. And he said, where's my money? Oh, it's coming. And knock, knock. And he said, no, I'm not coming out till I get my money. So we waited about a quarter of an hour, and the money finally arrived. So he was sitting there counting it out, and he said, you keep it. And I had a little jacket on. So I was there with this $10,000 in my pocket, and went backstage, back in the auditorium at the back, watching the performance. And the ballet is a Balanchine ballet, and it's a very intricate choreography, almost like knitting. There's these steps and all that. So Rudolf starting, and he was a stickler for his own choreography and also for other people's choreography. And so he started dancing, and the conductor went faster and faster and faster. And I thought, well, if Rudolf does the steps, he'll fall over because it's far too fast. And suddenly Nureyev stopped, clapped his hand, went to front stage and said, again, slower, which is unheard of in the middle of a performance. So that was quite fun. In February 1970, I was called on to go to Australia, to Sydney, to help Barry Kay put on the production of Don Quixote, the ballet, for the Adelaide Festival. And it was quite difficult because he was doing a production in Vienna at the same time, so he couldn't be in 2 places at the same time. And so they asked me to come out and supervise the production. And it was quite difficult because they had Barry Kay had his own style of painting and of looking at how you put something on stage, what he wanted, the look of it. And the scene painter was a very old-fashioned scene painter, and it was exactly what Barry didn't want. So I actually had to prevent the senior scene painter from painting the scenery because it was just impossible. So, but it was quite a difficult production because the costumes and the scenery was built in Sydney. The ballet company was rehearsing in Melbourne, and the first night was in Adelaide. And of course, Australia is a huge country, so the logistics was just... So at one stage we had to pack up all the costumes, transport them to Melbourne, which is a day by car, a day away from Sydney, do all the fittings, bring them back to Sydney, finish them, and then go for the production week to Adelaide. It worked out very beautifully in the end. And then 2 years later, this production was made into a film, again filmed in Australia, in Sydney, at an old airport, in Essendon Airport. And Rudolf insisted I was coming out, which I didn't know, but anyway, I went out there, and I went to... It was very difficult to get an air ticket out of the producer. And I went with his secretary to the travel agent, and she ordered the ticket, and fine. And I said what I wanted. I wanted a round-the-world ticket, which is fine, and it was agreed. And next day I went and collected the ticket. And when I looked at the ticket, it's a one-way ticket to Australia. And I said, no, I'm not having this ticket, but you have to. And I said, no, I don't have to. I went back home, or went back to Barry Kay, and the phone rang, the producer rang and said, why didn't I take the ticket and all that? And I said, well, it's not a return ticket. You have to trust me. I said, I don't trust anybody. I said, and it's against BAFTA union rules. I wasn't even the union. And so in the end, I got a return ticket, and I was the only one that got a return ticket. All the others had to pay their own way back. Don't Quixote. Or Don Quixote, and the Australians didn't know we went with Don Quixote, so we called it Don Quixote, Don Quixote production. Anyway, we were, Robert Helpman, the great dancer, played the Don Q, as we called him, and he's got the famous horse, Rosinante. And so they went to the knacker's yard, and they chose a very old horse, and the old horse came, and it was very thin, and it was very old, and very rickety, and all the dancers felt sorry for him and started feeding him apples and stuff. And the poor horse had a colic and died because of all these apples. So we had to get another horse. And of course, we couldn't find another horse that thin. So we had to make up the horse to look like the other horse, so it matched in the film. It was quite funny when I arrived in Australia to work on the film. Everybody had heard that this tough guy that didn't want to have the thing and have a ticket and all. And I arrived, and I was a hippie in those days. I had long hair and thin. So they kind of looked at me and thought, oh, total flake. And they wanted to say, you have to do it this way. I said, no, we're doing it my way. And we did. So in the end, and that was quite good. It was a very tough 2 or 3 months, this filming, because the first film day was the biggest set and the biggest costume, and everything was the biggest, so it was very tough. We worked for 4 days, day and night, to get it on the set. And we were absolutely exhausted afterwards, so we went for a picnic. And we were looking out for kangaroos and didn't see any. And then we had a little picnic, and suddenly there was this herd of kangaroos coming at us, which was great fun. Nothing to do with Nureyev, but Nureyev not only danced the principal character, he was also the director of the film, so it was very kind of tough on him as well. And as he was very a perfectionist, one day he was dancing his big solo, and it just didn't go well at all. It didn't go well at all, and so he decided to send everybody home and get all the assistants dressed up as extras around it, and to be able to dance this solo alone. But he couldn't. It had to have a continuation with people in the set. So that was done at 11 o'clock at night, and we were exhausted already, and I had to sit around and be there till the thing was in the can. The film was a great success when it came out. It was sort of said one of the best ballet films ever made. And it's shown perennially at Christmas and New Year everywhere. And when we were discussing our salaries with the producer said, oh, you don't need to get paid so much because this is going to be a very good movie. It's going to be shown everywhere. And we also said, we're living now. We don't live in 20 years' time at Christmas. We live now as well. We need to get paid. So in the end, he had to agree. And we didn't get any overtime, but that was fine. Rudolf was very busy. Usually when we were working on a production in the theater, we go out every night eating together. But in the film, it was so exhausting for him. He really wasn't up to do anything else but think about the film and preparing the next day shooting. On the movie, I was sort of the super assistant. I had to be everywhere and help everywhere and supervise mostly the costumes. We were able to get 2 very good costume makers from Canada to help us, which was wonderful. And I ended up dyeing quite a bit of the fabric for the costumes. And one of the costumes the fabric I dyed was for Kitri, that's the prima ballerina, Lucette Alders, her costume for the tavern scene. And years later, I was in the National Gallery in Canberra and in the costume department. And they said, oh, we've got some costumes from that film you made. And I said, fine. So they pulled out a drawer, and there was the costume where I had dyed the fabric for, which was very nice to see. And his costume of that scene, I actually have here. I bought it after his death at auction. In the 70s, I was working a lot in Italy, in Milan. And I was in Milan, went to an antique shop. And who was already in the antique shop before me was Rudolf. And he looked at me and said, you're here and you didn't come and see me last night. And I said, well, you've always got so many people. He said, no, nobody comes, so please come to the dressing room. And so I was able to go every night to see him dance, which was incredible. And we laughed a lot, and it was very fun. I went out to dinner afterwards. And then at one stage, he was dancing a whole series of Giselles in Milan with Margot Fonteyn. And he came to me and said, I haven't got my costumes with me. Can you have a jacket made for me and a cloak made for me for the second act? And so I went to the Scala Milan, the wardrobe department, and ordered these costumes for him, chose the fabrics, brought the fabrics to him, and he had them approved. And so I went back and said, the cloak has to be about that much on the floor, and so on. And so they made this cloak. And he said before performance, can I have a look at the cloak? I just want to see it. And I went to fetch it, and I went, oh my God, it's that much on the floor on me. And he's a good head shorter than me, so he was about that much on the floor. And I thought, oh, that's going to be a bit difficult. Anyway, I bring it to him. He said, oh, plenty big, he went. And I said, yeah, it's big. And so he sort of flung it around him, and he said, well, you have to go and have the lining attached to the outside, because I don't want to be on stage and just be left with the lining in my hand. He was very technical. He just knew exactly what was needed. So we had to the workman then sewed it up, and it was fine, and it became one of his favorite cloaks. Now, after his death, there was a big auction, and this cloak came up at auction, and I thought, yeah, I would like to buy it. But then it became very expensive, and I thought, what am I going to do with the big lump of velvet, And so it went quite high, and there was a rumor that this cloak had been given to him by Eric Bruhn, which was his partner for a while, another big dancer. And of course, people sort of reinvent stories. So that cloak was then bought by the director of the Paris Opera, Mr. Hegglin, who then donated it to the museum, the Nureyev collection in the museum in Burgundy. There's a theatre museum, costume museum, and there's a big section on Rudolf, and he donated it there. For the Kingdom of the Shades costume that I designed for Rudolf, I also designed him a necklace and a crown. And he said, no necklace, but the crown, yeah, fine. And okay, so dress rehearsal, and Rudolf comes on, he is wearing the crown, and he's doing his pirouettes, and suddenly the crown goes, sunk down, blinded him. And I thought, I'm going to hear about this. And he said, no, it's fine. Just put an elastic this way and this way, that won't happen again. So if he wanted something, it was fine. And he was just... Also, he was an incredible technician when he quite often created very, very complicated choreography. And the dancer said, I can't do that. And he said, yes, you can. And he showed them how to do it. And within seconds, they could do it as well. It was quite extraordinary. In 1966, when we were doing The Sleeping Beauty, the Scala, and I was a really greenhorn. I had not any experience in ballet at all. So I was sitting there with Nico in the rehearsal room, in dress rehearsal in the auditorium, and the dancers had, some dancers with sarabande had very long hanging sleeves, and they couldn't do it. So Rudolf said, I want scissors. So I was sent to go get a pair of scissors. And I ran up to the lift and had to go up to Scala. The wardrobe department was on the top of the building. So it took about a quarter of an hour till I came back with the scissors. And of course, by then, the dancers had learned how to manage these sleeves, and the scissors weren't used anymore. No. So there I learned that whenever a crisis was like that, I took my time, because it usually got resolved before. And that was quite funny with Rudolf, because he then realized that one was working with him rather than against him, and he appreciated that. I gave up designing in 1980. I had enough of theatre, and I started being a dealer in antique costumes and textiles. And Rudolf was a collector, and he collected fabrics and old clothes, historic clothing. And he lived around the corner from my apartment in London. So he said to me he was going to come and have a look what I had. And it was like the whole day. Then his landlady, a friend, phoned me and said, he's in a massage now. No, he can't come now. He will come later because he's at class. No, he can't come now. He comes late. And then he didn't come. And my assistant, Jan Reeder, was over from New York with me. And we're sitting there having dinner. And we're having a bottle of champagne. And suddenly the doorbell rings, and it's Rudolf. And panic-stricken, I've only got one bottle of champagne. So it went under the table, under the long under the long tablecloth. And so he came in with a friend and started trying on costume. It was like a performance, and he kind of bought quite a few pieces, and he wanted to buy a couple of pieces for Margot Fontaine. And then I sent him the bill, and he said, I can't pay right now because I've just spent $1 million buying an island in Italy. And then after about a year, I sent another bill and said, if it's not going to be paid, I want interest. And he got so furious, he didn't talk to me ever again. And I was still owed the money when he died. And he had a Swiss avocateur that looked after him. And these people were at the funeral, and so I presented myself, and the woman said, no problem, just send the bill. And I wasn't the only one, there were quite a few other people there he hadn't paid. This lawyer said, you have to wait a little bit because it's a very complicated situation with his will, but once it's all sorted out, you will be paid. Because he had sisters, and they thought they were going to get everything. And of course, he deliberately made wills that they got something, but that the main bulk of his estate went in 2 foundations. So I finally got paid. Also, I went over to New York and I phoned him. I knew he was in New York. He was living at the Dakota at the time, had an apartment at the Dakota. And so he said, what have you got? And I said, I haven't got anything. He said, well, hang on, I just have bought something. I'll bring it up to you. And I had just been in Italy and I'd bought a really beautiful court robe, a big pannier robe of 1730s, gold embroidered. And I thought, well, he's too stingy. He's not going to buy it anyway. So I can go and show it to him. So I went up and with other stuff. And the first thing he bought was this robe straight away. And he said, well, can I pay in 2 installments? And I said, that's fine. And I said to him, you can only buy it because we're going to have an exhibition in Japan on the 18th century, and this robe has to go into this exhibition. And he said, yes, fine. So then the exhibition came on, and he didn't want to give us the robe. And because I'm not sure, Japan, blah, blah. And so the Japanese ambassador had to get involved, Japanese ambassador in France, whom he knew. So finally we got the robe, and also he was promised that he was going to get the dummy that the robe was displayed on and the underpinning. So he agreed. And then a year later, the same exhibition was shown in New York, and so we asked him whether he would lend it to us, and he said yes. And the FIT is the Fashion Institute of Technology, where this exhibition was on, and the director, Laura Sanderbrand, went up to the Dakota to fetch the robe. And she went to the Dakota, she rang the doorbell, and the door opened, and she saw a pair of naked feet, and her eyes traveled up, and there was naked legs, naked knee, naked everything. He stood there, stark raving, naked. An old trick he loved to do that. He loved to shock people like that. There was a photograph of him in the nude taken by Avedon, and it was sold at auction. And I asked the auctioneer how much was it, and she said, about £1,000 an inch. Rudolf didn't like when you didn't understand him, because on stage he was such a great communicator. He communicated everything, but sometimes with his accent, and people didn't understand him, and then they were kind of unsympathetic, or they just wanted to know, what did you say? What did you say? And he really didn't like it. And I learned quite early on that you just pretended you understood exactly what he meant, because in the end, going on talking, you'd find out what it was all about. That stood me in good stead. And one evening I was at the nightclub, the music was pumping away, and Rudolf was in there, and he came up to me and he said to me, I have got a corps de ballet and I want you to organize it. And I thought, what, a corps de ballet? I mean, I don't know anything about corps de ballet. And I said, that's fine, Rudolf, let's talk on the phone tomorrow, and blah, blah. And so we did that, and then it turned out that he had Cordoba leather that he wanted to organize for his living room. So that happened quite often, so he just waited and clarified the situation a little later on, and it was quite clear. Rudolf had a villa on the edge of Richmond Park in London, and quite often after performance we went there for dinner. And one evening I was there, invited, and Jean-Louis, the great costume designer who designed Marlene Dietrich's big swan's-down coat and that rhinestone dress, and he also had designed Marilyn Monroe's Happy Birthday, Mr. President dress. And he was there with his wife, Maggie Louis, and a Japanese woman who was a great ballet fan. Mrs. Oya. And Mrs. Oya prattled on all evening, and she then gave me a lift home. And Rudolf had a companion, a lover, Wallace Potts, a very nice young man from Texas, and he was there. And on the way home in the car, she had a chauffeur. She asked me, "Hey, big house, Nureyev. Nureyev, big house. Where does Boris sleep? Where does Boris sleep?" And I said, "Oh, I don't know." She just wanted to know whether they were lovers or not. And he had a lot of fans that sort of came and bothered him. There was a couple of Australian women, elderly ladies, and wherever he danced, they turned up. Molly and I can't remember her other name. And they always brought him dried apricots. And he was so rude sometimes. He looked at them, "Oh, this shit again," and threw it away. But they just laughed, and they thought it was quite funny. And he had another fan who was very scary. She used to come and just stare at him. And she knew exactly where he was always. And she used to phone him and not speak. And it turned out she was a telephone operator. And we were having dinner in Milan, and he was sitting opposite me, and I was sitting, the room was in back of me, and suddenly Rudolf just went, he just stiffened, and I turned around, and this woman was standing there just looking at him. It was really scary. And that was the time when he was afraid he might get murdered by the Soviets because he had escaped. And it was a definite possibility because in those days they went around and murdered people like they do now. But it was very scary for him. Rudolf was an extremely hard worker. He was extraordinary. He did class, he did rehearsals and did performances all in one day, and he just worked all the time. And he quite often before the performance did a class, did a bar, or even danced a sequence through before even going on stage. And he had taken the Canadian Ballet Company on a big tour with his Sleeping Beauty. And it was in Chicago where he was preparing to go on, and it was quarter of an hour late. The performance started quarter of an hour late. And the public started to slow clap. And so he got furious. He went to the curtain, parted the curtain, stuck his head out and shouted, "Shut up!" And they did. That was funny when we did the Sleeping Beauty in Canada. I had to go to Paris to buy the feathers for the headdresses of this ballet, which had about 300 costumes. And I went to Paris and went to this merchant, and I was instructed to order only short feathers, and they always wanted to give me these enormous feathers. I had to say, no, it's ballet. It's not folie bergère, it's ballet. It's ballet. So I was in Paris buying feathers, as one does. Rudolf had an incessant interest in everything that was going on in the arts. He was interested in film, he was interested in painting, in literature, and he went to all the museums, went to all the exhibitions. And this also informed him when he was planning a production, when he engaged a stage designer. And he worked very closely with stage designers. For costume, he knew exactly what he wanted in the costumes. He knew what they should look like when they were in movement. A drawing is a drawing, but a costume is worn by a dancer, and therefore it moves. So he didn't want that a costume was too heavy when it fell down. So, for example, in certain dances, he wanted light materials so they could fall back gracefully and sort of finish the choreographic line. In Russia, when he grew up, men used to wear tights, but they used to wear kind of Pluderhosen, so kind of very pumpkin kind of shorts. And he absolutely refused to wear them. So he rebelled already then against certain things. And a trick he had, especially came to the fore in the Don Quixote movie. for the tavern scene, he wore a pair of pink tights and a pair of sheer black tights on top, so they would model his legs better. And when we were doing a production of Raimonda in Zurich, Raimonda does a dance with a veil, and so we went to the big fabric house in Zurich and got out bolts and bolts of fabric and threw those fabrics up in the air, and people just stared at us and what are these two madmen doing? But we needed to know how this chiffon, which we chose in the end, sort of came down softly, not just with a bang. Rudolf was well known and feared for his temper. He had a fearful temper. And people at the opera house in London said he was sent by the Soviets to put fear in them. And when we did the dress rehearsal, Scala Milan, for the Sleeping Beauty ballet, which he had choreographed and danced the principal role, the prince in it, he had written himself a big soliloquy, sort of like a Hamlet moment, to be or not to be, but in balletic terms, at the beginning of the second act. And when we did the dress rehearsal, he started dancing, and it didn't quite go the way he wanted. And so he tried again, and it didn't. So he said again, but the orchestra just played on. And so he got furious. He tore off his wig, threw it on the floor, and stomped out. And the orchestra played on, and there was a scene change, and a big group of naiads and dryads come out and they dance. And these girls came out, and some danced and some stopped because they couldn't see the prince, and it's big chaos. So then they stopped playing, which is very unusual because once a dress rehearsal is a dress rehearsal and doesn't get interrupted. It just stays. And so there was a big confusion. Of course, I was new in the theatre, so I thought, I wonder what's going to happen. And then Curingeli, the director of the opera, came out and said, just a minute. And so big discussion between him and Rudolf. And then they declared another simple rehearsal, so we could go on and rehearse. Of course, he had an incredible weight on his shoulders doing all what he did. Rehearsal, class in the morning, rehearsal in the afternoon and everything. So he hadn't really been able to dance this solo with an orchestra. So when the situation resolved, he came out and he was so furious. I've never seen him dance this solo better. He was really absolutely fired up, and it was absolutely fantastic. This episode cost the Scala quite a lot of money because they had to pay for the dress rehearsal and the extra rehearsal. And then even they did another rehearsal on the day of the first night. So it must have been quite expensive. The whole production was very expensive because Rudolf loved opulence. And this Sleeping Beauty, so it's at the court of King Florestan, so and it's in the 17th and 18th century, the beginning 17th century. Then they go to sleep for 100 years, and when they wake up, it's 100 years later. So that's the 18th century, and these costumes were quite elaborate. And Rudolf was very baroque in his tastes and sort of a bit oriental, for starter, roots showed through. And I had to explain to somebody, when we did a production in Buenos Aires, they said, it's costing too much. And I said, well, that's Rudolf. He is opulent. He doesn't go in for sackcloth and ashes. That's not Rudolf's style. He had a big collection of textiles in his apartment in Paris and his apartment at the Dakota in New York. He had hundreds of orbis and Moroccan rugs. And whenever he went anywhere, he went on big shopping trips. There was a big scandal in Paris at one stage. They were dancing Swan Lake in the open air, the Paris Opera Ballet. And the ballerina was Natalia Makarova, another Russian émigré, and a very famous Odette Odile in Swan Lake. And he let her drop deliberately because he thought she was misbehaving, and he just let her drop and walked out. It was a big scandal. they finished the ballet, and then afterwards, of course, in the press, it was a big hoo-ha-ha, and she accused him of, and then the director of the opera, Hegglin, who was there, came out and said, no, Rudolf was in his right, she really misbehaved badly. But of course, that's not a way of treating a ballerina, but he was a bigger star as she was. Then on another time, he nearly went to prison, because they were in Italy in the provinces dancing, and a ballerina was too near to him, and he thought, she was on point, and so in Italian he said, Jew, 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 and what he meant, go further down stage, and she meant go down on point, from point, and she didn't move, she just went down from point, and so he was so near to her, so he just did his pirouette with outstretched hand, and she flew out of the set because he hit her so hard, and of course that she then sued him, and but then he was fortunate because there was a general amnesty in Italy for some reason or other, and so he got away with it. In 1973, I was commissioned to design the sets and costumes for an opera ballet for the Teatro Donizetti in Bergamo. It was an opera ballet specially created for Carla Fracci. The costumes and the sets were being made in Milan. And Rudolf was in Milan at the same time dancing at the Scala. So I went every evening to see the performance and to talk and joke with him in the dressing room. And things were going really badly. It was very disorganized, and I really thought the production was going to be awful and hideous. And I spoke to Rudolf and sort of explained to him, and he said to me, looked at me and said, you know, a bad experience is better than no experience. And I thought, oh, you know, if he says that, it must be so. And I persevered, and I was very happy because it's one of the most successful things I've ever done. It was very, very chaotic, but it was a world premiere of an opera, and it was a great success. So I'm very happy I took Rudolf's sage advice. Ballet fans can and were sometimes a great problem. And as I mentioned before, there was these two older Australian ladies, Ethel and Myrtle, that came everywhere. They traveled to the States, they traveled to London, they traveled to Milan. And they made a bit of a nuisance of them, but they were harmless. And then there was Madame Oya. Madame Oya was a Japanese lady, about 5 foot high, and Bitrutan had a black page cut hairstyle and very red cheeks, and which she took out her lipstick and painted her cheeks with lipstick. She had these lovely round blots on her thing. And she was an ardent ballet fan. She used to invite or sponsor the Paris Opera Ballet to come to Tokyo and perform. And then she gave receptions, and then she appeared in a pink tutu. And all the male dancers had to lift her up like porteurs. That was her. She was immensely rich. Her husband was a manufacturer. And I met her in Rudolf's house in East Sheen at dinner one evening, and she was there. And she was stripping in jewelry, and she went, last night I crap, and hurt my finger because she was wearing an enormous ruby. And she had a ruby ring, a ruby necklace, ruby rings, ruby earrings. And she said, 5-carat ruby. Tiffany, Cartier, 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 Cartier. Besides Ethel and Myrtle, there were also other fans that followed Rudolf around. And not only quite few society figures like Princess Leo Radziwill, Jackie Kennedy's sister. She lived in London, and Rudolf stayed in her house in the beginning, in the 60s. And when Barry Kay, the designer, phoned to leave a message for Rudolf because they were working on a production, the butler always understood it to be Danny Kaye, the actor. Anyway, one evening in Milan at the Scala performance of the Nutcracker, we sat in the royal box, and next to me, or in front of me, was Lee Radziwill, Silvana Mangano, and her husband, the producer, Dino De Laurentiis. And then we all went out to dinner afterwards. It was quite extraordinary. It was just wonderful to work together with such a great artist who gave so much of himself. I mean, he received a lot, but he gave a lot. He was a great communicator. So he was quite unique. He got on stage and you could not help but watch him. I was in a performance of Swan Lake that he'd choreographed for Paris, but this was a performance at the Metropolitan Opera House in New York, and I was in the audience. And he had 5 boys or four young men, dancers, do variations, very fiendishly complicated variation. And he was playing Rothbard, the magician, and he stood with his back towards the audience. And everybody watched that back, watched him standing there doing nothing, whilst these boys tried to their best. It's complicated, intricate, Rudy choreography. I remember everything very fondly, and Rudolf was the most extraordinary personality. Very self-educated, but really very highly intelligent, and it was great fun as well. He had a great sense of humor. And it's a great tragedy that he died so young, because as a teacher and a choreographer, he could have gone on for quite a few more years. And it's a great loss to the world, to the theatre world and to the ballet world, that he so tragically succumbed to AIDS. I was very lucky and very privileged that I was able to work about 10 years together with Rudolf Nureyev, who at the time was the biggest star and biggest artist in the ballet world at the second half of the 20th century. And it was an incredible privilege to be able to work together with him at such close quarters, and being able to go and be his ambassador in different theatres and helping to put on his choreographic masterpieces. I was able to travel to Canada, to Australia, to Argentina, and work for him and with him. So that was really quite wonderful. And I shall immensely thankful for this experience. That was an incredible experience for a young man of 25.